Good day. Last 24 hours have witnessed important events in the world of international diplomacy. The Biden-Xi summit in San Francisco, which I will deal with first. The first UN Security Council resolution over the Gaza crisis, which I will discuss in more detail. And of course, we also have the ongoing events in Gaza itself and in Ukraine. And I will, in this program, touch on all of these various issues. But I'm going to start with the Biden-Xi summit in San Francisco. And can I say that straight away, the purpose of this visit of Xi Jinping to the United States, of the reason from the Chinese side of this visit, well, it became clear, very clear, over the course of the day. Essentially, the entire visit and the meeting with President Biden was a demonstration, a very clear demonstration, not just to the world, but perhaps most specifically to the political class of the United States, of the extent of Chinese power. And we can see that if we see the way the events of the day unfolded. Firstly, it's important to stress that this visit has been a visit and a meeting sought by the United States. Secretary Blinken, in particular, has been working incredibly hard to get this visit and this meeting set up. So has Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary. So has Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. So have various American business leaders. They've all been concerned by the deterioration of relations between the Chinese and the Americans, which has taken place over the course of the entire period of the Biden administration. Of course, the deterioration began during Donald Trump's time as president, but it has got much worse in the last few years since President Biden became president. And we've had various steps taken by the United States, by President Biden, by the administration, which have caused this relationship to deteriorate further still. And one amongst these were certain extraordinary comments, personal comments about Xi Jinping, made by President Biden himself, and by the way in which the United States and the administration mishandled the balloon incident at the start of the year. And the last was, so far as the Chinese were concerned, to a great extent, a kind of last straw. After those events, the Chinese, for several months, put the entire relationship between themselves, the political relationship between themselves and the United States, in a kind of deep freeze. The US began to become increasingly concerned about that. We had a troop of US officials, Blinken, Yellen, and others, go to the United States, basically pleading with the Chinese to resume the dialogue. And we have seen, over the course of the year, a series of events take place which, from the Chinese perspective, confirmed the strength of China's position. Firstly, we had China's incredibly rapid development of its super chip, which apparently is now in serial production, is being used in Chinese manufactured smartphones. It will no doubt find other applications as well. A development which, in my opinion, has shaken the belief in US technological supremacy and the belief that the United States can somehow block China's technological development, I think the only event it can be compared to is the Soviet Union's launch of the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, way back in 1957. So I think that was a major political shock for the United States. It showed that the idea of holding China back technologically was, if not a complete non-starter, something that would prove far more difficult than some American officials had perhaps expected. And then, of course, there was the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which took place over the course of the summer. There was this wide expectation in the United States, in the West, that Ukraine would at least make some important gains over the course of that offensive. It might not succeed in breaking through all the way to the Sea of Azov. There were some attempts prior to the launch of the offensive to downplay the prospects of that, though it's clear that some US officials, and apparently General Zaluzhny himself, still believed that a breakthrough to the Sea of Azov was possible. We now understand from General Zaluzhny that the expectation was that it would all end in some kind of great victory within about 4 months. And instead, 6 months on, the offensive has failed to make any progress. It's managed to capture a few shattered, deserted villages, but there's been nothing to show for all the enormous resources in men and machines that were committed to it. And as I will discuss later in the program, the reality is that the military balance in Ukraine is now shifting decisively against Ukraine. The Russians are getting stronger, the Ukrainians are getting weaker, and there doesn't seem to be very much that the United States is able to do. So these two events taken together have weakened America's hand. Now, there have been other things. The Chinese economy has been slow to recover from the pandemic lockdowns. Some people think that there are more deep-seated problems within the Chinese economy. My own sense overall is that the Chinese are confident that the problems that they are going through in their economy are not only manageable, but are essentially the product of the transition of China's economy from a labor-intensive model, labor-intensive, export-oriented model, which is the one that China developed in the 1950s, to a more technology-intensive, capital-intensive model, which is the one that we're starting to see emerge now. So I don't think the Chinese are as concerned about this as some people in the West are. Anyway, that's my view. So overall, I think the Chinese went to this meeting confident of their position and therefore intending to show to the Americans the extent of their power, to demonstrate China's power to the United States. And what they have seen is this procession of US visitors to China, begging the Chinese to resume the relationship. They've had the very important meeting of Janet Yellen to China, and it's widely believed, and I've seen many people now say this, it was point first broached by Tom Longo, but others have said it also, that the United States, the Treasury Department, wants China to resume buying US Treasury bonds. Whether they will or not, of course, that's an entirely different matter. We will see what the Chinese decide to do about that, but for the moment, anyway, that's what the Chinese are being asked to do. And the Chinese agreed, following all of these requests in the United States, that they should come, but they also insisted that the entire visit be controlled and choreographed very much in a manner consistent with Chinese sensibilities. So the streets of San Francisco were swept clean. Chinese residents of San Francisco, of whom of course there are many, came out with Chinese flags to welcome Xi Jinping. No protests or demonstrations were allowed anywhere near his motorcade. He had subsequently an important meeting with business leaders from the United States, and the Financial Times provides us with a very interesting account of this meeting. It starts, the title is US Business Elite Welcomes Xi Jinping with Standing Ovation. And then it goes on to say, at a San Francisco hotel on Wednesday evening, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a message to US business that got a standing ovation. China is a big market and friend. Crowding into the Hyatt Regency to meet the Chinese leader were Elon Musk of Tesla, Tim Cook of Apple, and Albert Bourla of Pfizer, all keen on selling more electric cars, iPhones, and pharmaceuticals in the world's second biggest economy. After a day spent in long-awaited talks with US President Joe Biden, Xi told an audience of about 300 people, China is both a super large economy and a super large market. Modernization for 1.4 billion Chinese is a huge opportunity that China provides to the world. The world needs China and the US to work together for a better future. China is ready to be a partner and friend of the US. And then we're told by the Financial Times that the warm feelings appeared mutual. If you go through the list of the top 20 US companies in China, they were all there, said one San Francisco tech titan who attended the event but did not want his name to be published. On his way into the Hyatt, Bridgewater founder Ray Dalio told the Financial Times he was excited to have this relationship with Xi Jinping. So there we go. Business community, they all come out, they give Xi Jinping a standing ovation, and Xi Jinping basically is telling the Americans, look, you can't prosper, you can't go forward without us. And the business community in the United States appears to agree with him. And who was there meeting Xi Jinping at the airport? It was Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. She still presumably wants Xi Jinping to buy US Treasury bonds. She too remains very anxious to keep the relationship between the United States and China on a stable footing, as of course the Chinese business community, the American business community also wants. And then of course there was the meeting itself. And as typically happens, we now have an immensely long Chinese readout describing the meeting from the Chinese perspective. And I'm not going to go through the readout. It is very long. But we do get a sense of what happened over the course of it. Can I say, first of all, that one of the most useful things when leaders meet is to look at the body language between them. And it was striking that President Xi and President Biden, when they met, there was nothing effusive about their meeting. They didn't seem to be pleased to meet each other. There were no real smiles. One didn't get the sense that these are two leaders who are relaxed and happy and friendly and happy to meet each other. The contrast with a far more warm atmosphere when President Xi met with President Putin in Beijing just a few weeks ago could not be starker. And then we had pictures of President Biden sitting in the Filoli estate, a venue chosen by the Chinese, apparently, and the time frame of this summit was also chosen by the Chinese. The Chinese said that they would only hold this meeting at the APAC summit. Xi Jinping would only come at all, provided that the summit meeting took place before, making it absolutely clear to the world that for the United States, it is the relationship with China that matters far more than any other relationship between the United States and any other Asia-Pacific country. So the Chinese chose the venue, or at least they suggested the kind of venue that they wanted, and they chose the exact timing of the meeting. I've said already that this was a minutely choreographed visit, choreographed principally by the Chinese, with the Americans, of course, falling in with Chinese plans. Anyway, the meeting then takes place, and we see the pictures of the two leaders of the two delegations. We see Secretary Blinken sitting next to President Biden. He seems almost to be assisting President Biden through the meeting. President Biden doesn't initially look especially happy. He then breaks into an extraordinary wan smile that continues for an unusually long time. Eventually the meeting does take place, and it happens obviously behind closed doors. And if you believe the Chinese readout, which by the way I largely do, what then happens is the presidency throws the book at President Biden, or perhaps that's putting it too strongly. What he actually does is he gives President Biden a long lecture about his faults and about the faults of the United States. I said I wasn't going to read it, but I will read some passages from it. So we have what is in effect the opening paragraph. President Xi Jinping noted that China and the United States are faced with two options in the era of global transformations unseen in a century. That's already, by the way, a warning of what's to come, because what Xi Jinping is basically telling President Biden by that is that this last century, which you dominated, your country dominated, is over, it's ended. You are no longer the superpower that you once were. So that's why you have to deal with us. And then he goes on to say, one is to enhance solidarity and cooperation and join hands to meet global challenges and promote global security and prosperity. So that's the good route that one can follow. The other is to cling to the zero-sum mentality, provoke rivalry and confrontation, and drive the world towards turmoil and division. And of course, looking at the world today, looking at what the policies of the United States have been over the last 3 or so years, it's not difficult to see again that Xi Jinping is saying that this is the route that you've been following, and look at the turmoil and division that you've created. And he goes on, but the readout goes on to say that two choices point to two different directions that will decide the future of humanity and planet Earth. So it's up to you. You can cause more turmoil and division, or you can work with us, putting aside the idea that you are the world's leading power. That was the last century. The new century is different. You can either work with us, in which case we can have global security and prosperity, or if you don't, what we're going to get instead is turmoil and division. And of course, Xi Jinping then says that the world is big enough to accommodate both countries, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other. So China's rise is not something that the United States needs to be concerned about, because it's actually an opportunity for the United States. So don't give up these plans that you have to try to prevent us rising. They're both unnecessary, and they're going to create turmoil and division. And just to emphasize the fact that China is not a threat to the United States, Xi Jinping then went on to say this. President Xi Jinping elaborated on the essential features of Chinese modernization and its significance, China's development prospects and its strategic intention. China's development is driven by its inherent logic and dynamics. China is promoting the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts through Chinese modernization. It will not take the old path of colonization and plundering, or the wrong path of seeking hegemony with growing strength. And again, it's not difficult to see that what Xi Jinping is saying is that China is not going to become the United States of the future. It's not going to pursue hegemony and plundering, and it's certainly not going to be an imperialist power like the Western powers once were, pursuing the old path of colonization. He went on to say, it does not export its ideology, which is, of course, again, what he would say the United States does. And then he went on to say this, it has no plan to surpass or unseat the United States. So, if you work with us, if you work alongside us, we will work alongside you. We are not here to replace you as the world's leading power. We don't see that as our business. We want to see, as he put it in another part of the readout, we want to see a stable, healthy and sustainable relationship with you. And then he says, it is not our plan to surpass or unseat the United States. But then he went on to say, likewise, the United States should not scheme to suppress and contain China. So it's a lecture. He's reading out a lecture. He's telling Biden, you've got us all wrong. You're going about everything in the wrong way. You're creating turmoil and division. The fact that the world is in the mess that it is at the moment is your fault. We are strong. We're going to get stronger. We're not seeking to surpass or suppress you. What we want to do is to work with you to build a better world. But of course, if that happens, you need to take our concerns fully into account. And he then listed all sorts of things that the United States needed to do in order to modify its policies. He mentioned, for example, that US actions against China regarding export control, investment screening, and screening and unilateral sanctions seriously hurt China's legitimate interests. But then he went on to say, President Xi Jinping elaborated on China's principled position on the Taiwan question. He pointed out that the Taiwan question remains the most important and sensitive issue in China-US relations. China takes seriously the positive statements made by the United States in the Bali meeting. The United States should take real actions to honor its commitment of not supporting Taiwan independence. Those words in the readout, Taiwan independence, are in quotation marks. Should stop arming Taiwan and support China's peaceful reunification. China will realize unification. This is unstoppable. And of course, Xi Jinping, saying all of that, knows that the United States, the Biden administration, has just proposed to Congress a package, a financial package of $166 million worth of military of aid to Taiwan, which includes apparently $80 million of aid to modernize Taiwan's army. And there's been an article in the BBC which says that this package is only the first of more to come. Eventually, the United States intends to supply Taiwan with $10 billion of financial assistance in order for Taiwan to modernize its ground forces. So, what you get from this lecture that Xi Jinping delivers to Biden is, well, a further statement of China's positions. He does not obviously really expect the United States to change its policies, at least the Biden administration, to change its policies towards China. I don't think he has any expectation of that at all. In fact, the agreements that came out at this summit are so minor as to be insignificant. Military to military contacts will resume. It's hardly a significant concession. There'll be discussions about climate change and about artificial intelligence. And that, it seems, is about it. No real substantive movement on any of this. But Xi Jinping has demonstrated to the Americans again how indispensable China is, how powerful it is, how it can force the United States to agree to choreograph a visit from the Chinese leader to reflect Chinese sensitivities, clear the streets of San Francisco, hold the meeting in a place and at a time the Chinese want. Xi Jinping has also shown to the Americans how the business community, the American business community, wants this relationship to continue and to prosper. And at the same time, Xi Jinping has used the opportunity to deliver another stern lecture to Biden, who he knows perfectly well is going to go away and then go and do the exact diametric opposite of whatever it is that he promises that he's going to do. And Biden himself made that essentially clear in the subsequent press conference, which was, again, another public relations disaster. Because once more, over the course of the press conference, with US officials looking extremely, shall we say, well, unhappy, President Biden again spoke of President Xi Jinping as a dictator. He again used that word, calling President Xi Jinping by that word. And of course, the Chinese government has already made clear China's displeasure at this. But it's the fundamental problem that any negotiations with the United States on the part of China will face whilst President Biden remains in office. Even though he has been told by his officials, by Janet Yellen, by Secretary Blinken, by the people in the Pentagon, that he's got to get a dialogue with China started again. Even as the business community in the United States lobbies him, telling him that this economic war between China and the United States is going nowhere. Even as the science people, the people who are in charge of technology, are dismayed about the fact that the Chinese have developed their super chip and seem to be moving forward in other areas of high technology. Even as he hears all of this, even as he finds himself playing from a weak hand with the failure of the war in Ukraine, nonetheless, President Biden cannot overcome his visceral feelings, his deep antipathy to President Xi Jinping personally, and his deep dislike of the idea that China, the country that he sees as the autocracy, is now insisting that it is at least, at the very least, the equal of the United States. So he comes out and blurts out his meanings, what he really feels, in his press conference, admittedly off the cuff, in response to a question, but we can see that that is President Biden's real feelings. And we can also see that in the meantime, he was also talking about how the US will take steps to defend its allies in the Pacific. Obviously, entirely the wrong thing to say, following a meeting with Xi Jinping, that it was the United States, which the United States sought, and which was intended to put the relationship with China on a better track. So Xi Jinping can go back to China. He has demonstrated to the Americans themselves and to the world the extent of China's power. He's been able to force the Americans to choreograph this visit to suit his sensitivities. Of course, he's heard what the old man in the White House has had to say. He probably senses that at the end of the day, despite what the business community in the United States wants, there are far too many other people in the United States who continue to want confrontation with China, for China to relax its guard. So he will continue, Xi Jinping will continue, as the Chinese government will do, they will continue to take the steps to insulate their economy from US sanctions pressure. They will continue to build up their armed forces. They will continue to take steps to counter any US attempts to support Taiwan in its independence bid. Xi Jinping warned Biden that reunification is ultimately unstoppable, a clear statement of eventual intention. But in the meantime, he will feel that in a sense he has put the Americans in their place. So, an interesting visit in many respects, not one that is going to change anything in terms of the wider relationship between China and the United States. If you want a real sense of where the Chinese really see the relationship with the United States going, perhaps a much more interesting sign is a recent agreement that the Chinese have just concluded with the Russians, whereby the Russians agree to supply China, that they will supply China with food and agricultural products and with oil and gas deliveries, securing China's access to these essential supplies with provisions that they should be supplied in many cases over land so that they cannot be the subject of a US blockade. There's been several agreements of that nature, and another one has just been concluded by the Chinese and the Russians. You can see that even as the Chinese go to Washington, demonstrate their power there, remind the Americans of how strong they actually are, the Chinese, practical people as they are, continue to take the necessary precautions to cover their rear in case the situation begins to deteriorate again and things turn really ugly. Well, that's all I'm going to say about this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping. I predict that it will become a punctuation mark in the history of US-China relations. I certainly don't think it will be any sort of turning point. Now let's turn to the other big crisis that's going on at the present time, which is the crisis in the Middle East. And here we have had an important development in the form of the first Security Council, UN Security Council resolution. The first resolution that the Security Council has passed since the beginning of the Gaza crisis on the 7th of October. I've been saying that we would eventually start to see more movements in the Security Council, in the United Nations. We had that meeting of the Islamic states last week. I said that that would almost certainly lead to more steps being taken in the United Nations, and now we have seen those steps, and we have had a resolution, an actual resolution, pass the Security Council. And the important thing to understand about this resolution is that the United States was not happy about it. It did not support the resolution. It abstained. 3 countries, in fact, abstained. The resolution was proposed, by the way, by Malta, an interesting choice to propose a resolution of this sort. Malta is, of course, a member of the EU, but it is also a Mediterranean state. It is also a country with a long and very close historic relationship with the Arab world. In fact, the Maltese language contains many, many Arab loanwords. Just saying. So Malta was clearly partly chosen to support this resolution. But before we actually turn to the resolution itself, the voting on the resolution is in some ways as interesting as the resolution itself. And I should say in advance that this is a first resolution amongst many. There will be other resolutions following from this one, and over time they're going to become stronger. But let's turn first to the voting. Now, the thing to understand about this resolution is that it does not specifically refer to a ceasefire. And the Russians proposed to amend the resolution in order to harden the language so that the call in the resolution for a humanitarian pause, we will come to that, be converted into a call for an actual ceasefire. Now, 5 countries supported the Russian draft. And the 5 countries that supported the Russian amendment were Brazil, China, Mozambique, Russia itself, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, note here that all the BRICS states on this occasion voted together. Brazil, China, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is not yet a member of the BRICS, but it will become one very soon. Mozambique, of course, is not a member of the BRICS, but it is increasingly aligning itself with the BRICS in these debates in the Security Council. Now, 5 countries voted for this resolution, for this Russian amendment. And of course, the Russians drafted this proposed amendment in an interesting way. They took the text of the resolution, the ceasefire resolution that has just passed in the General Assembly, and they basically grafted it on to the Maltese draft resolution. So they said that Malta wants a humanitarian ceasefire. The General Assembly has already called, so Malta wants a humanitarian pause. The General Assembly, however, has already spoken about the need for a ceasefire. So let's be consistent with what the General Assembly has asked for. Let's strengthen the language of this resolution by converting the language of the resolution, this draft resolution, from a humanitarian pause into a call for a ceasefire. And 5 states, the BRICS states plus Mozambique, supported Russia's call. Now, that's only 5 out of 15. What will have concerned the United States is that 9 countries abstained. The United States itself voted against this amendment. It does not want to see a ceasefire resolution pass the Security Council at this time. The United States voted against, but it was the only one to do so. 9 countries, Albania, Gabon, Ghana, Ecuador, France, Japan, Malta, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, all abstain. Malta, instead of voting against a Russian proposed amendment to its own resolution, abstained. So did Britain and France, Japan, and Switzerland. So the United States was left alone voting against a ceasefire resolution proposed by Russia. Now, to be very clear, this is not an exercise of a veto. For the Russian draft to have carried, it would have needed the support of 9 countries in the Security Council, not just 5, and only then would a US vote against have amounted to a veto. But nonetheless, the United States finds itself alone voting against a Russian proposal to convert a resolution calling for a humanitarian pause to an outright ceasefire. And then, of course, the voting happened on Malta's draft, which only calls for a humanitarian pause. The United States abstains. They're not happy about the text of the resolution, as we will see. Britain also abstains because it is the United States' invariable ally nowadays in the Security Council. Russia also abstains. The reason the Russians abstain is because, of course, they say that they're not happy with the fact that the resolution only calls for a humanitarian pause, and they're saving their ammunition for the next draft resolution, which they're going to propose, which will again, of course, call for an outright ceasefire. All of the other countries, every other country, Brazil, China, all the others, France, Switzerland, Japan, Malta, they all support the resolution. And the UN Secretariat has provided us, not interestingly with the text of the resolution itself, but with an understanding, a sense of what this resolution will, what it consists of. And it seems that the resolution calls for, well, I will go to the highlights of what the UN says it consists of. It says that the UN Security Council succeeds in finding unity adopting Resolution 2712 on the Israel-Palestine crisis. The resolution calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza for a sufficient number of days to allow full, rapid, safe and unhindered access for UN agencies and partners. It calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, especially children, as well as ensuring immediate humanitarian access. There is universal international consensus about this. It then goes on to call for additional calls on all parties to refrain from depriving the civilian population in Gaza of basic services and aid indispensable to their survival, consistent with international humanitarian law. And that is, of course, a clear warning to Israel. It wants the Israelis to lift their embargo, their blockade on Gaza, to agree to extended humanitarian pauses. It wants food, energy and water to be supplied unhindered to the people of Gaza, and it wants international humanitarian law to be observed. Importantly, the resolution did not condemn the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. It is looking at the current situation in Gaza itself. Britain and France were unhappy about the fact that the resolution did not condemn Hamas. That was the reason the United States gave for its refusal to support the resolution. But the resolution, in the event, did not condemn Hamas, and even countries that are allied to the United States, Japan, France, Switzerland, Malta, of course, as well, voted for the resolution. The Israelis are very unhappy, and there's been a very strong statement from Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. He's said this on X. He says the UN Security Council's resolution is disconnected from reality and is meaningless. Regardless of what the Council decides, those are, by the way, unwise, reckless words. Regardless of what the Council decides, Israel will continue acting according to international law, whilst the Hamas terrorists will not even read the resolution at all, let alone abide by it. It is unfortunate that the Council continues to ignore, not condemn, or even mention the massacre that Hamas carried out on October 7th, which led to the war in Gaza. It is truly shameful. And the ambassador went on to say that Hamas's strategy is to deliberately deteriorate the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and increase the number of Palestinian casualties in order to motivate the United Nations and the Security Council to stop Israel. It will not happen. Israel will continue to act until Hamas is destroyed and the hostages are returned. Now that is, in my opinion, a reckless statement. It expresses outright defiance of the Security Council. It says that even if the Security Council eventually votes for a full ceasefire, Israel will simply disregard it and will continue to do so until the point is reached when Hamas itself is destroyed. And that is an unwise thing to say, and it is going to solidify international opinion further against Israel. Now, the call for the release of the hostages, the unconditional release for the hostages, is important, an important one. But Israel, by taking this stance, the ambassador, by taking this stance, unfortunately, is providing Hamas on this issue of the hostages with a potential get-out-of-jail clause. Because even though the resolution clearly says that the release of the hostages should be unconditional, Hamas inevitably is going to turn around and say, why should they release all of the hostages when the Israeli ambassador is already saying that Israel is not going to comply with the rest of the resolution? So we will continue to get this complicated game that is being played out in Gaza at the moment, where Hamas negotiates extended humanitarian pauses, releases a few hostages in return for each one of these pauses, and in the meantime, the pressure for converting these humanitarian pauses into an extended, indefinite ceasefire increases. And in fact, we've had an article about the nature of the pressure on the Financial Times, in the Financial Times, and it came yesterday. And it said that Joe Biden is under pressure to rein in Israel's military campaign within weeks. And the article goes on to say Joe Biden is under mounting pressure to rein in Israel's high-intensity military campaign within a matter of weeks as US allies, administration officials, and Democratic Party members recoil at the mounting death toll in Gaza. We've just seen how the Israeli ambassador is trying to shift the blame for all of this onto Hamas, and perhaps with some cause. But I said right from the outset, when the Israeli military offensive into Gaza was first debated, that it looked to me like a trap, that it would be inevitable that if the Israeli military entered Gaza, there would be international pressure because of the civilian casualties on Israel to stop. And I have always doubted that Israel would be allowed to continue its military operation until Hamas is fully destroyed, because I can't see how the United States and Israel's allies can continue to resist the mounting pressure for a ceasefire. And essentially this is what the Financial Times is telling us. And we saw the first results of that in the Security Council resolution, which was passed yesterday, which calls for extended humanitarian pauses for Israel to lift its blockade and for Israel, in effect, to abide by international humanitarian law. And we go on to read in the Financial Times, unease over Israel's approach from its military offensive in Gaza to the escalating tensions in the occupied West Bank has steadily grown within Biden's administration, with internal frustrations spilling over in meetings and through official channels for dissent. And we then go on to read, Western diplomats said Biden, a steadfast ally of Israel, was now under pressure to push Netanyahu's government into easing off the military operation. The White House's tolerance of the death toll in Gaza and the public reaction to it could wear thin as soon as the end of November, the diplomats said, a notion that has been recognized in Israel's too. And then we go on to read Eli Cohen, who, by the way, I think is one of the more capable members of Israel's government. Israel's foreign minister told reporters on Monday that Israel had 2 to 3 weeks before it faced significant diplomatic pressure for a ceasefire. Another Israeli official acknowledged the time pressures, estimating the military had several weeks for the current operation. But Israel's defense forces are planning on the basis of various scenarios, including the possibility of a shorter or longer war. And we see that this is consistent with what Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, said a few days ago, that Israel had perhaps 3 weeks in which to complete this operation, and others have been saying the same thing. And even Israel's foreign minister, Eli Cohen, is apparently recognizing that the pressure is mounting. And the dam has not yet burst on this. We've not yet got that ceasefire resolution from the Security Council, but we are edging ever closer to that point, and that resolution that the Security Council passed yesterday is a very important further step in that direction. Let me repeat again that in political terms, all that Hamas has to do is to survive this military operation, to continue to exist as a political and military force in Gaza, in order to be able to say that politically it has won. And the Israeli military operation, which is still underway, might be conducted in the most efficient way imaginable. It might be making genuine inroads into Hamas's military structures. And by the way, I'm getting competing views about this. I've had many authoritative people telling me that the Israelis are actually making real progress. I've heard some, perhaps slightly less authoritative people, telling me the opposite, that the Israelis are basically operating around the edges of what Hamas's structures, that they're able to destroy the Gaza Parliament building, but these are symbolic things, that they don't interfere ultimately with Hamas's organization and its military cohesion. But anyway, even if the Israelis are able to make some progress, if at the end of this Hamas is still there, it will have won. Henry Kissinger, all those years ago, back in the 1960s, at the time of the Vietnam War, actually explained this. He said that an insurgency, all that an insurgency has to do is not lose in order to win. And that is exactly the playbook that Hamas is following. So that's where we are with this conflict. In Gaza, first resolution, now passed, things are proceeding, and I have to say this, in political and diplomatic terms, very much along the lines that I anticipated, and it does seem to me as if we're moving inexorably now towards that next resolution, always assuming, of course, that the United States doesn't itself decide that in order to avoid a situation where it is faced by calls for a ceasefire resolution, which it can no longer veto in the Security Council or block in the General Assembly, it will have to contact the Israeli government and tell it to agree to this ceasefire itself. So we're coming closer to these steps, to this position, and according to the Financial Times, Eli Cohen, who is Israel's foreign minister and therefore the person most in contact amongst Israeli ministers with the opinion of world governments, even he appears to recognize that Israel has 2 to 3 weeks left before it faced significant diplomatic pressure for a ceasefire, pressure that it might not be able to resist any longer. And just to finish on this again, I think that Ambassador Gilad Erdan's comments about this UN Security Council resolution, the implication, the insinuation that Israel will simply defy a resolution of the UN Security Council, which is binding under international law, and will defy the Council if it were to vote for a ceasefire. I think that was unwise, and I think that somebody from the Foreign Ministry, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, needs to tell him so, and needs to advise him in future to moderate his language. Anyway, that's where we are with the situation in Gaza. Now, there's been an awful lot more going on in Ukraine. Yesterday, there were reports that the Ukrainians made an attempt to storm Gorlovka, a town in Donbass, in Donetsk, which the Russians have held for a long time, and which is a heavily fortified position on the Russian defense system. This is the same place, by the way, which apparently Zelensky demanded some weeks ago that the Ukrainian army capture, and the generals who were ordered to capture Gorlovka refused to carry out those orders. They thought that this was beyond Ukraine's power to do. Well, events apparently have taken place in Ukraine now, which appear to suggest that President Zelensky's position has perhaps strengthened a little, or strengthened sufficiently, that he is now able to not only have the order to attack Gorlovka, heeded, but actually executed. Now, I haven't been following the details of this particular battle, but from my understanding, so far, it has been unsuccessful. And I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians are going to be allowed by the Russians to capture Gorlovka. It seems to me an entirely misconceived attack at a time when the Ukrainians would be far better advised to go onto the defensive in every front. And in fact, there's been a massive discussion of the state of the war by Big Serge on his Substack channels. Big Serge is a military historian, and he's been talking about previous wars, but he's now applied all his knowledge from his discussions of wars to the war in Ukraine. He's discussed at length the complete failure of Ukraine's offensive, summer offensive. He makes the entirely valid point that it is simply unrealistic to expect the United States and the Western powers to resupply Ukraine with the type of weapons, the level of weapons and equipment that Ukraine was supplied with in advance of that offensive. And if that offensive therefore failed, how can any future offensive succeed, especially given that the Russians are themselves becoming stronger? So Big Serge makes that point. He also makes the further very important point that many of these operations that the Russians are carrying out, places like Kupiansk, the Vremivka salient, and all of the rest, they have about them the quality of the Russians putting constant pressure on the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainian army is not being given the opportunity to rest and recuperate and rebuild, which it desperately needs after it has exhausted itself in this fruitless offensive that took place in the summer. And Big Serge does not outline the future direction of the war. That's not, I think, what he chooses to do. But we can see how attrition is not only working in favour of the Russians. I mean, that's clearly implicit in his very long study, but the attrition is intensifying, it is accelerating, and the West, in contrast, is becoming weaker about this. And so is Ukraine itself, and the political situation in Ukraine is also becoming more unstable. Now, I should say that there's a report this morning, which I don't give much credence to, but there's a report that one particular senior Ukrainian general has now apparently been detained. There's even a report that General Zaluzhny himself is being detained, which, as I said, I don't give much credence to. But we can see that the political situation in Kiev continues to be very unstable. And I'm going to suggest here a possible view linking all of these various events to the recent developments in Krinky or the Dnieper River, which have been so much debated and talked about. Now, yesterday, as I said, Sladko, the governor of Kherson region, the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, spoke for the first time about the situation in Krinky. He said that about 150 Ukrainian soldiers are holed up there, that Ukraine has lost up to 2 battalions of men trying to cling on to this bridgehead. The bridgehead has been completely contained by the Russian forces, and the Russians are taking steps to squeeze it out. And yesterday, Dima, at the Military Summary Channel, provided a detailed account of the countermeasures that the Russians are now taking against this particular bridgehead. And if my understanding of Dima's analysis is correct, he thinks that it's only a matter of time before the Russians do indeed manage to extinguish this particular bridgehead, which the Ukrainians have established in this small place at so much cost, achieving so little with it. But going back to what Sladko said, there was a rather interesting point that he made, which I missed in my program yesterday. He said that Russian intelligence had got wind of the Ukrainian plans in terms of this offensive and of the entire Kherson operation altogether. He said that the Ukrainians had expected to capture the town of Novaya Kakhovka, which is on the Russian bank of the Dnieper, the Russian-controlled bank of the Dnieper. It was where the Kakhovka dam used to be. That the Ukrainians were expecting to capture this important town by the 15th of November, which was yesterday, coincidentally the same day that Sladko published his piece. And Sladko also said that this was going to be the start of a major, big operation, and that the Ukrainians were expecting to reach Genishek, the current administrative center of Russian-controlled Kherson region, which is, by the way, a coastal city on the Black Sea, that they were expecting to get there by mid-December. And according to Sladko, this has failed totally. The Ukrainians have only managed to establish this minor bridgehead. There's only 150 Ukrainian soldiers there. The life expectancy of those soldiers is just 2 days. The Ukrainians have suffered the equivalent of 2 battalions worth of losses in creating this bridgehead, and in fact the entire plan has therefore been a complete failure. Now, of course, that's what he says, and we don't know that this is true. It could be that he's just making all this up. I mean, things like that do happen. But what if he's right? And what if that is the reason why he published his comment yesterday, which happens to be the 15th of November, the day when the Ukrainians, according to him, were supposed to have captured Novaya Kakhovka? Well, if that is correct, then I'm going to make a number of suggestions, and these are pure suggestions, speculations if you like, but, indulge me with this. We know that a couple of weeks ago, some time ago, before he retired as chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, with the British also there, had a rather tough meeting with General Zaluzhny, all about recalibrating Ukraine's southern offensive. We know that General Milley and the British told Zaluzhny, stop this pointless operation in Bakhmut, concentrate all your forces on trying to break through in the south, severing the land bridge and all of that, threatening Crimea. That is what we've given you all this expensive weaponry for, and that is what you must now do. And if you go back and look at that time, it is indeed the case that the Ukrainians redeployed large forces to Zaporozhye region to try to restart their offensive in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, though I have to say they didn't achieve any real success there. But it's also at about this time that the Ukrainians started to redeploy their marine brigades from the Vremivka salient and started to redeploy them to Kherson region. Could it be that this was part of the plan that Milley and the British and Zaluzhny hammered out in that meeting that took place a couple of weeks ago? That the plan was that the Ukrainians would resume the offensive in the Verbovoye Rabotino area, and that simultaneously there would be this advance across the Dnieper into Kherson region, capturing Novaya Kakhovka by the 15th of November, pushing on towards Genishek by mid-December, and whether perhaps also all those missile strikes on Crimea, the delivery of the ATACMS missiles, all of those things, was all part of this great plan. Well, if that is right, then clearly the plan has miscarried at every level. The missile strikes have been unsuccessful overall. The Russians have been able to shoot down more and more Storm Shadows and ATACMS missiles. Fewer and fewer of them are getting through. Occasionally they do get through and do some damage, but none that is going to change the outcome of the war to any significant degree. The advance in Rabotino, Verbovoye didn't turn out well either. And this latest attack, this attempt to launch an offensive across the Dnieper, has proved a failure as well. A tiny bridgehead was established, quickly contained by the Russians. Enormous losses have been experienced, and there's clearly not going to be a breakthrough there. And might that perhaps explain Zaluzhny's comments to The Economist? He would have known about these plans because, of course, he agreed with them. He would have known at the time when he spoke to The Economist at the end of October that there wasn't going to be a breakthrough in Kherson region or anywhere else. And in fact, he said as much. And of course, he then went on to say that it wasn't his fault. He didn't receive all the weapons that he wanted. He was in effect justifying himself to the Americans and the British because the great plans that he agreed with Milley all those weeks ago in that meeting have miscarried. And it's perhaps not surprising, given that that is so, that he would do that. He's trying to transfer the blame onto others, partly onto the West, it must be said. Of course, he's also no doubt been quietly blaming Zelensky as well, saying that Zelensky continues to give these irrational orders to attack places like Gorlovka and Bakhmut and do other things like that. And that might explain some of the current political tensions in Kiev, and it might also explain why Zaluzhny went so completely off-piste as he did in that article in The Economist. Anyway, these are, and I say it straightforwardly, speculations, but, well, why not indulge sometimes in a few speculations? They're not unfounded, and I would suggest that they do, if true, go very far to explain recent developments and recent events. William Burns is supposed to be in Kiev. There was a rather morose article in the Financial Times which admitted that public support in the West for this war, again, this war in Ukraine, has now, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. He said that this article spoke about the West's need to come up with some kind of plan over what to do, but of course it didn't propose a plan, and I get the sense that no one in the West, least of all the President of the United States, who, it must be said again, remains the ultimate decision maker. No one in the West seems to have a plan, and in the meantime, the military situation, Ukraine's military situation, as discussed by Big Serge in that massive article, continues to deteriorate, and he discusses at very great length the battle in Avdiivka and the way it is developing. And by the way, there's been much more news about further Russian advances in Avdiivka. The noose around Avdiivka does appear to be tightening, and I will repeat again that from what I can see, events in Avdiivka are moving faster than I myself would have anticipated. Now, all of these military activities are happening against the background of very bad weather, heavy fog, lots of rain, soft ground. that must have affected Russian military advances to some extent. I can't help but think that Big Serge is right, that the Russians resolved that they were not going to let the period of the Rasputitsa allow the Ukrainians time to rest and reorganized, and this is perhaps more than any other reason why the Russians continue to push so hard on a broad front. But in Avdiivka at least, I suspect that things are going to start moving faster when the ground hardens and when the air clears, when the season of fogs and mists is past. And I suspect the same is going to prove to be the case in Kherson region as well. From the way the Dima described it, this bridgehead has only a relatively short time to survive, and it's depended heavily on the protection provided by the fog, but the season of fogs and mists will soon be behind us. So, anyway, that's where we are about the war in Ukraine. Now, this is where I'm going to end this video. I've covered a lot of ground: Xi Jinping's visit, the ceasefire resolution, events in Ukraine themselves, but all of them taken together point to a situation, or so it seems to me, where the administration, the US administration, is having to contend with problems on multiple fronts. Jake Sullivan has now admitted that the situation in Ukraine specifically is keeping him awake at night. I can fully understand why. If he wants to get himself some sleep, the solution is there. Picks up the telephone, talks to Putin, discusses peace. At least on that front, he could probably still find some means to come to some kind of agreement for a way forward, which would at least allow the problem of Ukraine to be resolved, obviously, overwhelmingly on Russian terms, and giving time and space for the United States to worry about other things. But of course, he's not going to do that. He's not going to do that about the Gaza situation. He's not going to do that about any other situation. It seems to me that Jake Sullivan, and no doubt others in the administration, are going to have many more sleepless nights ahead of them over the next few weeks. Well, that's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. You can also check out our shop and find all the amazing things there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.